The New York Times editorial board is out this morning with a 5,000-word essay.
There is outrage in India following an article published in the New York Times.
An article in the New York Times.
The New York Times.
The New York Times.
The New York Times.
The New York Times has been headlining the American mainstream media for decades. Being a pivotal source of news that is consumed every day, we investigate the history of how it was shaped and developed over time to ask the key questions. How has the New York Times changed throughout the decades? Did it have the same perspective and bias, or has that changed over the years? The New York Times was established in 1851 by journalist and politician Henry Jarvis Raymond and publisher George Jones. Raymond, a significant player in federal politics and a contributor to the New York Tribune, joined hands with Jones, a former New York banker turned Tribune writer. Together they envisioned a newspaper that would focus on addressing and reshaping radical ideas. Through their own resources and early investor funding, they launched the New York Daily Times with issues sold for a penny, equivalent to about 40 cents today. The New York Times gained recognition in an era when printed news was the mainstream source of information. During this period, sensationalism and hyperbole in news reporting were common strategies to retain mass reader interest. This practice, known as yellow journalism, is evident from the front pages of the era, where newspapers featured flashy, divisive headlines to entice readership and increase sales. This ploy extended to visual elements as well, with tableau-style reporting using vibrant headlines and lurid images to attract reader attention, as seen in this front page. The sensational headlines like "Death Through Lacing" or violent narratives like "Extraordinary Duel with Broadswords" typified the era's reporting style, characterized by exaggeration, misinformation, and unreliable news. The intention was to skew or bias news stories for reader reaction, using entertainment rather than focusing on critical events shaping their society at the time. The New York Times diverged from the prevalent reporting style of the time, focusing on engaging an intellectual readership rather than the wider populace, and doing so in a measured, objective manner. The advantage of this approach was that their news coverage exhibited minimal bias and adhered to the core premise of news gathering, fact-based reporting of worldwide events. This can be observed from their early publications, which appear starkly simple compared to the sensationalist newspapers of the era. In contrast to other papers of the time, there are no eye-catching headlines with extravagant captions. Indeed, the predominant part of the paper is occupied by extensive textual coverage on a single topic. The headline, "The Union Forever," is displayed in bold but small font, particularly when compared to typical headline font sizes of the era. Following this, we see succinct facts related to the event and the rest of the page dedicated to exhaustive reportage on the incident. It covers multiple facets like statements and actions by prominent individuals, public reactions and factual details, along with potential societal repercussions of the events. While this newspaper didn't fit into the standard reporting practice of the time, it was clearly designed to educate and inform readers about global happenings rather than entertain them. A reporting approach that continues to form the foundation of mainstream news coverage even 2 centuries later. The objective journalism approach proved to be worthwhile for readers, although it initially resulted in financial losses for the New York Times, with monthly deficits exceeding $1,000. The scenario changed when Adolph Simon Ochs purchased the newspaper in 1896. He not only increased the sale price, but also insisted on delivering objective news and impartial coverage. Remaining dedicated to covering international news, Ochs made a significant move by completely omitting sensationalized content or tabloid sections from the paper. It was during this period the New York Times started to build its reputation as a fair and reputable news source, bolstered by its coverage of significant events like the sinking of the Titanic in 1912, and the extensive reportage of World War I from 1914 to 1918 and World War II from 1939 to 1945. For nearly 120 years, the New York Times maintained a distinguished reputation as a premier provider of objective and high-integrity journalism, recognized not only in the US, but globally. However, in 1971, the publication found itself embroiled in its first significant controversy with the release of the Pentagon Papers. Given unauthorized access by Daniel Ellsberg, a research associate at MIT, the New York Times went ahead and published the significant documents in its editions. This publication was groundbreaking in two ways. Firstly, it disclosed the full extent of the United States military activities in Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, from 1939 to 1968. The exposure of this previously confidential information, which led to public shock and criticism, prompted the U.S. Department of Justice to secure a temporary restraining order against further disclosures by the New York Times. However, following a protracted legal battle that reached the Supreme Court, the publication received permission to publish the material under the First Amendment's protection of free speech. Their efforts were recognized with a Pulitzer Prize for exceptional public service and journalistic achievement. Despite the controversy, the Pentagon Papers incident ultimately bolstered the New York Times' reputation, reinforcing their commitment to true journalism among their readers. However, the era of the Internet in the 1990s marked the beginning of the decline for print news. In response, the New York Times launched an online edition in 1995, and by the early 2000s had begun to emphasize its focus on digital news. In the era of emerging technology within print journalism, the New York Times faced accusations of bias from one of its own contributors. In 2004, Daniel Okrent, the public editor, penned an opinion piece asserting that the publication was displaying a liberal bias, deviating from its traditional objective reporting principles. Okrent pointed to the coverage of social issues like gay rights, gun control, and abortion, arguing that these reports leaned more towards progressive viewpoints than neutral reporting. He particularly criticized the paper's coverage of gay marriage, accusing it of being overly positive and overlooking potential controversies. Initially, Okrent's claims didn't trigger significant concern, as the New York Times continued to be perceived as credible, and Okrent was viewed as an outlier among the journalists. However, in the following years, instances validating Okrent's allegations started to surface. One significant case involved Judith Miller, a New York Times reporter who covered the invasion of Iraq from 2003 to 2006. Miller reported that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction, a claim that influenced key figures like Dick Cheney and arguably impacted the US decision to invade Iraq in 2003. In a surprising turn of events, Miller's sources, upon which her claims were based, proved to be unreliable, and the alleged weapons of mass destruction were never found. The inaccuracy of her reportage subjected both Miller and the New York Times to intense scrutiny. Miller left the publication shortly afterwards, defending her actions as being in good faith given the information available at the time. Yet this incident signified a dip in the accuracy and fairness standards of the New York Times and led many readers to question the publication's objectivity. The issue of biased reporting persisted, as observed during the Israel-Palestine conflict from 2000 to 2005, amid the Second Intifada. Harvard's International Journal of Press Politics noted that articles in the New York Times appeared decidedly pro-Israel, evidenced by the use of headlines, images, and lead paragraphs that were favorable to Israel. The journal also pointed out that the New York Times predominantly used Israeli sources for its coverage. Transitioning to subsequent events, it's worth examining how the New York Times coverage shifted during and after the elections of Presidents Obama and Trump. Even aside from perceived bias, the New York Times has occasionally published articles with uncertain factual accuracy, seemingly in an effort to attract readership. A case in point is from October 2023, when the newspaper initially ran a headline reading, "Israeli strike kills hundreds in hospital," Palestinians say, following a missile attack on a hospital in Gaza. This piece gained a considerable audience. However, Israeli officials disputed the airstrike, attributing the incident to a misfired rocket from the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, while the original report stemmed from Hamas sources. Given the uncertainty surrounding the attack and the casualties, the New York Times modified the article and issued an apology to its readers for the misleading impressions created by the initial report. This incident underscores the need to either validate information or adequately indicate potential uncertainties to readers prior. The New York Times evolution reveals a consistent adherence to its foundational principles of journalism. Initially, it took a stand against sensationalist news, focusing on delivering global news equitably. This commitment manifested notably in the 1990s when the paper achieved acclaim for its publication of the Pentagon Papers, solidifying its reputation as the paper for the people. However, the passage of time saw the introduction of misinformation, biased reporting, and opinion pieces prioritizing the writer's perspectives over an objective, global viewpoint. Consequently, their standing for unbiased and objective reporting slipped to levels comparable with many politically partisan mainstream media sources. Public opinion mirrors these changes. A Hollywood Reporter survey of 2,210 respondents indicated that only 24% found the New York Times to be very credible, while a further 28% considered it somewhat credible.